Opening the center grants swift access for your queen and bishop to the battlefield. Prepares to challenge the center, subtly setting the stage for a French defense pawn structure. Claiming central space like this immediately invites a fight for dominion and dictates the pawn structure's future battlegrounds. Immediately challenging the center establishes symmetrical pawn lines, creating a dynamic equilibrium of central influence. Developing the knight here prepares for kingside castling and pressures black's central pawn structure, aiming to seize initiative. Developing the knight to its natural square, the horse prepares to contest the center and influence key diagonals. Pinning the knight here forces black to address the immediate threat, potentially disrupting their pawn structure or piece development. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing for castling, this move calmly develops a piece while maintaining flexibility. Pushing the pawn cramps black's pieces and initiates a race for central control, potentially opening lines for attack. Pivoting the knight to d7 strategically reroutes it, preparing to challenge white's central pawn advance and potentially shift queenside pressure. Sacrificing the bishop for knight initiates a pawn race, aiming to expose the black king. The queen is now actively involved, centralizing her presence and contesting the e-file's dominance. Reinforcing the central pawn chain, f4 boldly stakes a claim for further queenside expansion and restricts black's knight development. Preparing to pry open the queenside while solidifying the pawn structure. Developing the knight towards the kingside aims to reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for castling, while also eyeing potential outposts. Asserting central influence, black challenges white's pawn structure and aims to open lines for counterplay. Preparing for a pawn storm on the kingside, while simultaneously solidifying control of the d-file. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for a dynamic fight for open lines is key here. Castling queenside dramatically escalates the pawn storm potential along the kingside for white. Igniting queenside counterplay, this thrust aggressively challenges white's spatial advantage. Sacrificing the pawn opens dynamic lines but potentially weakens your central control, demanding vigilant piece play. Reclaiming the pawn ignites a dynamic fight for central squares and opens diagonal possibilities for your queenside pieces. Developing the bishop to the active diagonal solidifies the kingside and prepares for central pressure. Aggressively challenging white's center and opening lines, this move seeks to disrupt the harmony of white's kingside castling and create dynamic play. Realigning the knight to a more active square, this repositioning aims to bolster the center and prepare for potential kingside action. Securing the king's safety is paramount, especially with white's queenside castling and potential pawn storm. Refocusing queen pressure onto the queenside initiative, seeking central pawn breaks while keeping king's safety paramount. Initiating a decisive exchange, black clears the d-file, aiming to exploit white's vulnerable king in the center. Opening the c-file now allows for a fight for central control and potential pawn breaks. Pushes forward, eyeing the queenside expansion and potentially opening a path for the rook. Securing the monarch on the queenside now allows for bolder pawn pushes and potential file openings. Targeting the queenside pawn structure, this bishop eyes potential weaknesses and hints at future queenside expansion. The rook claims a vital open file, preparing to exert pressure and potentially disrupt black's queenside structure. Ramping up pressure on the queenside by contesting the open c-file, threatening to unravel white's central pawn structure. Anchoring the rook on the d-file solidifies control and prepares for potential advances on the queenside or central breakthroughs. Diverting the queen to the queenside seeks to activate her and prepare pawn advances there, while leaving the king somewhat exposed for now. Simplifying by trading queens opens up the center and prepares for a sharp battle of maneuvering pieces. Securing the knight on the queenside opens avenues for the remaining pieces to become active. Repositioning the knight to d4 sharpens the fight for central squares and eyes the queenside outposts. Relocating the king from the dangerous central crossfire allows it to find refuge behind its pawns, preparing for the potential pawn storm on the queen side. Launching a pawn storm on the king side, black's king is now exposed to potential attacks through newly opened diagonals. Reclaiming central influence and preparing for kingside expansion defines this pawn push. Prying open the kingside, this thrust aims to exploit the open f-file for attacking potential. Simplifying the position after the exchange, black forces a favorable endgame by eliminating white's active rook and preparing to occupy the open c-file. King safety is paramount. The monarch now retreats, seeking refuge behind its pawns. A desperate check from black to gain a tempo, hoping to avoid the imminent pawn storm and subsequent material losses. Shifting the king towards the queen side offers vital cover from the ongoing central onslaught. Reactivating the knight to contest central squares and prepare for pawn advances offers dynamic counterplay. Exchanging these knights clarifies the pawn structure and simplifies the position toward an endgame. Re-establishing a pawn chain on the queen side, this recapture aims to solidify black's pawn structure and potentially prepare for queenside activity. Repositioning the knight aims to reinforce the d-pawn and challenge black's control over key central squares. Repositioning the rook to pressure the d-file, eyeing white's weakened structure. Carving out space on the king side, white prepares to unleash a pawn storm, seeking active counterplay against black's exposed monarch. Relinquishing central pawns concedes the initiative and opens lines for white's rook. Snatching that pawn opens a critical diagonal for your knight, creating immediate tactical threats. The king ventures out into the open, seeking safety on the queen side but risks exposure from white's centralized knight. Sacrificing a knight to expose the black king is a sharp tactical gamble that forces concessions. Grabbing that pawn opens up your king to a dangerous attack on the king side. Targeting the exposed king, the rook penetrates, seeking to dismantle black's remaining defenses and force concessions. Reclaiming a pawn at this juncture strengthens the central control and prepares for potential pawn breakthroughs on the king side. Seizing the 7th rank now allows immense pressure on black's isolated king. This maneuver attempts to regain a pawn and simplify, but it exposes your king and allows white's centralized control of the d-file. Initiating a forceful assault on the black king, this forcing check aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially win material or create mating threats. Reactivating the king's central presence, this pawn-grabbing thrust, though tempting, exposes the monarch to immediate tactical dangers on the open diagonals. This rook maneuver aims to solidify king safety and potentially exploit the vulnerable black king on the dark squares. Bringing the bishop to f5 opens lines and targets white's advanced king. This pawn push aims to restrict black's bishop and create potential attacking avenues on the king side. Aggressively venturing the king forward opens new avenues for attack, but risks leaving it exposed in the center. Securing the passed pawn with the rook allows for significant endgame pressure, threatening to advance further and disrupt black's defenses. Shifting the bishop to a more active square, preparing for a potential exchange and freeing up the knight. A stunning check from the knight, directly targeting the exposed king and forcing it into a desperate flight. Seizing the pawn opens a path for the white king, creating immediate threats around black's exposed monarch. Capturing the pawn opens the d-file, finally leveraging white's central control and creating immediate threats against black's exposed king. Unleashing the passed pawn now creates immediate pressure on white's queen side. Harnessing the opened king's path, this knight repositions to disrupt black's counterplay and secure a decisive advantage. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority now, creating a dangerous passed pawn. Capturing the pawn opens the file, potentially creating a decisive avenue for your rook. Opening that b-file creates an immediate threat of exposure for white's king. Reclaiming the pawn on c5 finally untangles white's pieces. Initiating counterplay by repositioning the bishop aims to disrupt white's passed pawn and pressure the king side. Relocating the rook to the 7th rank initiates an aggressive endgame pursuit, aiming to exploit the exposed black monarch. The black king, despite its proximity to safety, now ventures further out, seeking active participation in the unfolding material exchange. Re-establishing central pawn presence opens up avenues for the remaining pieces to operate. Reactivating the rook's control on the opened file, aiming for deeper infiltration. Anchoring the knight on a strong square creates a formidable outpost, eyeing multiple weaknesses in the black position. Bringing the king out from its passive defensive post and onto the queen side opens up a dynamic fight for space. A proactive outpost for the knight offers robust central control and prepares for a potential pawn push. Black repositions the rook, preparing to challenge the d-file and pressure white's vulnerable pawn structure. Forking the king and rook disrupts the black pawn structure and forces material concession. Seeking refuge from the rook's pressure, this king maneuvers into yet another exposed position. Initiating a strategic repositioning of the knight to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support a pawn advance. Unblocking the knight allows it to reach a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a kingside attack. Shifting the king now opens diagonals for potential threats, while solidifying white's central presence. The bishop's repositioning prepares to harass white's king further, potentially activating pawns. King begins a final march, seeking central control and to escort its pawns. The king's escape route is now wide open, creating immense pressure on white's pawns. Securing the king's escape route adds a crucial defensive layer to white's endgame setup. The black king, far too exposed, now scrambles to find safety amidst the ensuing pawn chaos. Securing the d-pawn's advance creates a dangerous passed pawn. Advancing the pawn chain gains crucial space and opens a diagonal for the bishop. Asserting central pawn control opens up avenues for the king and activates the remaining piece. Pivoting the rook to b6 unlocks lines and pressures white's queenside pawns, aiming for a more active position. Forking the king and pawn forces a tactical retreat, aiming to simplify into a winning pawn race. A desperate attempt to escape the net, but the king remains exposed. Activating the queen's rook pawn creates immediate counterplay, forcing black to defend its king and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. Pushing the pawn forward aggressively opens up avenues for counterplay and challenges white's pawn majority on the queen side. The king's exposed position is now critical, demanding immediate attention to prevent further penetration. The rook slides back, allowing the pawn chain to advance and aiming to create a passed pawn on the king side. Dislodging the defender with a timely check opens a path to harass the exposed king. Chasing the knight with the king is a desperate gamble, likely leading to disaster. The rook repositions, eyeing the pawn majority on the queen side, aiming to disrupt black's advancing structure. The bishop repositions, preparing to support a potential pawn advance or retreat along the now open 7th rank. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical path for the king and creates immediate mating threats. Capturing that bishop sacrifices material, but might open up lines for your queen and rook to attack white's exposed king. Seizing the open file decisively, aiming to advance the passed pawn. The pawn advances, seeking to disrupt the rook's defensive posture. A precise check that forces the black king into a potentially awkward position, allowing white to regroup and consolidate. The black king desperately seeks refuge from the encroaching white pieces, hoping this diagonal offers a brief respite before further complexities unfold. Unleashing a knight to eye the king's escape route promises a swift conclusion. Unlocking the pawn's potential offers a glimmer of hope, aiming to disrupt white's controlled position before their king is fully exposed. Disrupting the pawn structure is the immediate goal, opening lines for the knight to penetrate. King's safety is paramount. Venturing this far from defense invites severe reckoning. Snaring the knight opens a clear path to promoting the pawn, a decisive endgame advantage. The black king, exposed and far from sanctuary, embarks on a final, desperate dash. Pushing the b-pawn forces black's king to navigate through a newly opened diagonal. The perpetual check opportunity is seized, preventing white's king from finding safety on the queen side. The monarch bravely steps into the fray, aiming to exploit black's overextended pawns and activate its own potential. The rook's retreat strategically occupies the b-file, preparing to contest white's b-pawn advance while keeping an eye on the kingside pressure. Guarding the pawn and preparing to advance the kingside majority, a subtle shift in the battle's geometry. The rook's perpetual check offers a brief respite, preventing the decisive king march. Shifting the king to a safer square averts further checks while preparing for potential pawn pushes. After a long struggle, the rook's position on the open file is now contested, creating a vital stalemate scenario for the king. The rook's repositioning to the d-file aims to secure the king's safety and potentially support a pawn advance. Seeking shelter for the monarch, but the king is still quite exposed in the center. Advancing the pawn creates a decisive passing threat, forcing black to react urgently to prevent a promotion. Activating the rook along the newly opened 7th rank to challenge white's pawn structure is a bold, albeit risky, initiative. A subtle repositioning, seeking to trap the rook by threatening a pawn advance and controlling key squares. The king scurries to safety, seeking a better square amidst the looming pawn storm. Unlocking the passed pawn's potential is paramount now, forcing the opposition to react. Seeking to exploit the open files and create a passed pawn, black must consider if this rook maneuver truly aids that objective or simply drifts. Guarding the 7th rank with the king opens a path for the rook to support a pawn advance. This aggressive check forces the king to a potentially exposed square, sacrificing a pawn for initiative. The king seeks refuge on the queen side, aiming to support the passed pawn's advance. The rook's check forces the king to a less secure square, setting up a potential mating net. The king is exposed on the 6th rank, inviting further complications. Swinging the rook back to the open file creates a final desperate check, but the white king is well protected, and the material disadvantage is too great to overcome. King walks into a perpetual check trap here, desperately seeking refuge. The rook's journey to the 1st rank creates a potent blockade, aiming to stifle white's passed pawn. A bold attempt to seal the deal by activating the rook, aiming to box in the black king.